Welcome to the deep dive.
It's your shortcut to getting seriously in the know really fast.
You guys sent us a ton of info, like a crazy
A
amount.
mountain of it.
A mountain. And we've gone through it all
Every last bit.
to give you the need-to-know stuff just for you.
Tailored to you, basically.
Today, we're tackling Davos.
The World Economic Forum, their big annual shindig in Davos, Switzerland.
Happened this past January the 20th to 24th.
And the theme this year was collaboration for the intelligent era.
Sounds pretty highfalutin.
It does, doesn't it? But
Yeah.
it really captures the vibe of what went down.
Definitely sets the stage. And it wasn't just a bunch of professors and think tank types, right? We're talking serious heavy hitters.
Oh yeah, more than 50 heads of state and government.
Wow.
Plus top dogs from every part of the public and private sectors. A real power crowd.
You know, what struck me about this Davos was the timing. It came right after we saw those first glimmers of hope for a ceasefire in the Middle East. And get this, it landed smack dab in the middle of the U.S. presidential inauguration.
Talk about a convergence of events. You couldn't have planned it better if you tried.
It really set a unique tone for the conversations, I bet.
It did. That alignment of the political and geopolitical calendars definitely injected a particular kind of energy into the whole thing. There were, of course, some pretty strong disagreements. I mean, you've got all these powerful people in one room.
Yeah.
But the overarching feeling was that the discussions were, really thought-provoking and ultimately aimed at finding some kind of common ground.
That's encouraging.
One thing that really stood out was a palpable optimism about the U.S. economy.
Interesting.
That view became a bit more cautious when folks turned their attention to Europe.
Makes sense.
And emerging markets were seen as surprisingly resilient, kind of weathering the storm.
Okay, so much to unpack here. Let's start with geopolitics.
The big picture stuff.
Exactly. This idea of needing a constructive optimism, that seemed to be a big theme, right? What did that actually look like in the discussions?
Well, just think about it. Over 50 heads of state and government all in the same place.
Yeah, it's huge.
That alone tells you something about the weight of the issues on the table. A lot of them gave these special addresses, laying out their take on the biggest global challenges.
I see.
And when we talk about constructive optimism, I think it reflects this desire to acknowledge the serious stuff. Geopolitical instability, economic uncertainty, climate change, all the big scary things.
Right.
But it's coupled with a commitment to actually find solutions, to work together, not just throw up our hands and say, we're doomed.
So not just optimism for optimism's sake. It's about finding a path forward.
Exactly. Actionable optimism. Now, when it came to specific hotspots, obviously the situation in Ukraine was front and center.
President Zelensky's plea for stronger European defense support, that really resonated.
Absolutely. And his point about not taking European security for granted, that was a powerful message. He basically said, look, relying on the goodwill of a few capitals isn't a sustainable security strategy.
So the takeaway there is that European security needs to be a collective effort.
A united front. And then there's the Middle East, another flashpoint that demanded a lot of attention. Israeli President Isaac Herzog seemed pretty hopeful about the ceasefire in Gaza.
He did.
He saw it as a crucial first step towards securing more hostage releases.
Right. And we also heard from Qatar's Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Mohammed bin Abdulrahman Al Thani, who stressed the importance of open communication and mediation.
That's right. He was all about keeping those lines of communication open as the best way to achieve a lasting peace.
So two different leaders, two different approaches, both focused on the same complex issue.
It really underscores the intricacies of that situation. Multiple players with their own agendas.
Trying to navigate a very fragile landscape.
Absolutely. But perhaps the biggest geopolitical elephant in the room, so to speak, was the return of Donald Trump to the White House.
I can only imagine the buzz.
It was definitely a major talking point. His previous policies on tariffs, deregulation, energy, those had a huge impact globally.
And the fact that the annual meeting kicked off on the very same day as his inauguration.
Talk about dramatic timing.
Pure coincidence, but still.
It definitely added a layer of, shall we say, anticipation to the proceedings.
So what was the general sentiment? Were people freaking out?
Well, a few days into the meeting, President Trump actually gave a virtual address to a group of global CEOs. He laid out his agenda for this term, really pushing the idea that the U.S. is the best place for businesses to grow and create jobs.
A real America First message.
Definitely. He even said under the Trump administration, there will be no better place on earth to create jobs, build factories, or grow a company than right here in the good old USA.
A pretty strong statement.
It was. Now, WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala had a really interesting response to all the hype. She basically said, don't hyperventilate.
I love that.
Her point was, let's wait and see what policies actually get put into action and what their real-world effects are before we jump to conclusions.
A voice of reason.
Exactly. It wasn't all about the big global players, though.
Right.
There were also a lot of discussions about how different regions are navigating this shifting global landscape. For instance, India's efforts to break down internal barriers and boost economic growth were a hot topic.
Fascinating.
And Africa was a major focus too, especially with the new climate initiative and the upcoming G20 summit hosted by South Africa, a sign of the continent's growing influence.
For sure. And Latin American leaders were all about building climate resilience and dealing with complex trade dynamics. It's a region facing a unique set of challenges and opportunities.
Definitely. And of course, China's continued role as a major engine of global growth was a big conversation.
Always is.
It was interesting to hear some folks talking about ASEAN as potentially the most attractive region for investment in 2025. Southeast Asia is definitely on the rise.
Absolutely. Okay, shifting gears to another huge topic. Climate, nature, and energy. The big question seems to be, can we actually turn things around?
Yeah, the outlook isn't exactly rosy. The news that 2024 was the warmest year on record globally really sets a somber tone.
It's a scary reality check. And when you see things like those massive wildfires raging near Los Angeles, it brings the abstract data on climate change into sharp focus.
It does. The impact is becoming impossible to ignore. And it's not just isolated incidents. We've seen a 5-fold increase in extreme weather events over the past 50 years.
That's mind-blowing.
And then there's the financial toll. Over $3.6 trillion in damage from climate-related disasters since the year 2000.
It's a staggering number.
It is. Johan Rockström from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research made a really striking statement. He said that these days, practically no extreme weather event happens without some trace of human influence on it.
We're directly impacting these events.
We are. And Al Gore, he put it in even starker terms. He talked about how we're releasing 175 million tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere every single day.
Every day. Wow.
Trapping heat equivalent to 750,000 of those first-generation atomic bombs exploding every single day.
That's a terrifying image.
It's meant to be. Now, against this backdrop, we have President Trump's return and his moves on energy policy.
Right, like that executive order to ease regulations on energy production in the U.S.
Exactly. And at Davos, he talked about the need to double the energy to power AI and even suggested using good, clean coal as a reliable backup.
That seems to signal a potential shift back towards more traditional energy sources.
It does. But then you have Fatih Birol, the executive director of the International Energy Agency, offering a different perspective. He challenged this idea of having to choose between energy security and the transition to cleaner energy.
Interesting.
He argued that we can actually achieve both with well-designed policies. And not only that, but those policies can also lower energy prices and create jobs in the renewable sector.
So it's not an either-or situation.
Not at all. There's room for both. Another key theme at Davos was the responsibility of businesses to factor the environment into their decision-making.
So it's not just about profits anymore.
Not solely, no. It's about companies recognizing that the health of the planet is inextricably linked to their own long-term sustainability.
Makes sense. What about the global economy? I know there was some optimism there, particularly around the U.S.
There was, but there were also some underlying concerns. The word tariffs popped up a lot, and the whole love-hate relationship the world has with the U.S. dollar was a big topic.
It's the dominant currency, but it's not without its issues.
Exactly. And Harvard economist Kenneth Rogoff, he voiced some pretty serious doubts about the U.S.'s fiscal trajectory. He suggested that both major political parties seem to be treating government debt as if it's not a big deal.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, not a great sign. And this reflects a broader anxiety among economists at Davos about the rise of global public debt in general.
I see.
Geeta Gopinath, the IMF's deputy managing director, gave a pretty stark warning. She said the situation is worse than imagined, with global public debt hovering around $100 trillion.
That's an insane amount of debt.
It is, and to make matters worse, the cost of servicing that debt is going up because of rising interest rates.
So it's a double whammy.
Exactly. And then, in a move that surprised a lot of people, President Trump launched his own cryptocurrency, Trump P, just days before taking office.
Wow.
Coinbase CEO Brian Armstrong was actually pretty positive about it. He saw it as a sign of a U.S. president embracing the crypto world and maybe even pushing for clearer regulations.
So, potentially a good thing for the crypto industry.
Maybe. The week ended with the release of the Global Economic Outlook report. It called for a degree of confidence, but also cautioned against complacency, especially when it comes to managing debt and inflation.
So, a mixed bag.
You could say that it's a complex economic landscape out there.
For sure. Let's talk about jobs, health, and inclusion.
Mhm.
It sounds like there was a real push to make sure those areas don't get overlooked.
Absolutely. Empowering women was a huge theme.
I heard Spice Girl Melanie Brown was even there.
She was. But more importantly, there were serious discussions about closing those persistent gender gaps in health, political representation, and economic opportunity.
Right.
Anita Zaidi from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation pointed out that for every dollar invested in women's health, you get an estimated $3 return.
That's a pretty good investment.
It is. And Catherine Russell, the head of UNICEF, talk about how healthy, engaged women contribute to the prosperity of society as a whole.
It's about the bigger picture.
Exactly. And Anna Buda from the World Bank added that global GDP could be 20% higher if women participated equally in the economy.
Those are some serious numbers.
They are. The health and well-being of young people was another big focus. Jonathan Haidt from NYU presented some really interesting ideas on how we can use digital technologies to actually improve the well-being of young people.
That's encouraging.
It is. He specifically addressed the challenges facing what he called the anxious generation, those growing up in our hyper-connected world.
It's a tough time to be young.
It is. And it wasn't just the scientists and policymakers talking about AI. Cultural leaders also weighed in, discussing both the potential benefits and the risks.
I bet that was a lively discussion.
It was. Their main message was, we must preserve humanity in the digital age.
A good reminder.
Definitely. And of course, we can't talk about the future without talking about jobs. The Future of Jobs report found that 39% of current job skills will likely be transformed or obsolete in the next 5 years.
That's a huge chunk of the workforce.
It is. Mina Al-Arabi from The National summed it up well. She said that while most workers aren't necessarily afraid of change, they're worried about being left behind if they don't have the right skills for the future.
So it's about making sure people are prepared.
Exactly. Okay, let's wrap things up with AI, technology, and industry. This was a really forward-looking part of the Davos discussions.
I kept hearing about this term, agentic AI. What's that all about?
So agentic AI refers to systems that can go beyond just processing information and making predictions. These are AI agents that can actually make decisions and take actions on their own to achieve goals. Like, imagine a personal assistant that can not only schedule your meetings, but also negotiate contracts on your behalf.
Wow.
And industries in the intelligent era was a major theme at Davos. So the implications of this kind of AI were discussed across all sorts of sectors: electric vehicles, cybersecurity, smart factories, even government and national security.
I can see how that would be a game changer.
Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president, talked about the global race in areas like AI, clean tech, quantum computing, and space. She made it clear that this is not just about innovation, it's about strategic leadership on the world stage.
Well, high stakes.
Definitely. And the discussions about securing the supply chains for electric vehicles were really interesting. Panjan from CATL, a big player in EV batteries, stressed that the EV revolution is a global phenomenon. It requires international cooperation to succeed.
Makes sense.
There were also a lot of conversations about how governments need to adapt to this rapidly changing technological landscape.
What were some of the challenges they identified?
Well, things like outdated bureaucratic systems, fear of adopting new tech, and cybersecurity concerns in the face of digital transformation. These are all significant hurdles.
It's a big shift for governments.
It is. One session even focused on how governments need to reconfigure themselves to effectively use AI in this new era.
So a call to action for governments to get with the program.
Basically. And then we had Jan LeCun, Meta's chief AI scientist, making a pretty bold prediction. He said we're likely to see a new paradigm of AI architectures within the next 5 years, potentially surpassing the capabilities of the current large language models.
Wow.
So the AI landscape could look radically different in the near future.
It's moving so fast. So to sum up this deep dive into Davos 2025, we've explored a world wrestling with incredibly complex and intertwined challenges.
We've talked about the delicate dance of geopolitics, the urgent and multifaceted issue of climate change and energy security, the uncertain but potentially resilient global economy, and the vital pursuit of jobs, health, and inclusion.
And of course, the transformative and ever-evolving landscape of AI and emerging technologies.
We've encountered a wide range of perspectives, some stark warnings, and some inspiring calls to action.
And despite the hurdles, there was a definite current of optimism, especially around the outlook for the U.S. economy and the potential of technological advancements.
So for you, our listener, we leave you with this question. As you consider all these discussions, what single area do you think will have the biggest impact on our world in the coming year?
It's something to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.